Another night, another set of mysterious stories. As per usual, I will be sharing a number of creepy tales with all of you. From monsters in the woods, monsters at work, and even monsters in the house. This video yet again shows that the strange and unsettling can strike anywhere, at any time. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to narrate their stories. Their links can be found in the description. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Please be sure to drop a like if you enjoy, as it helps out the channel in a very real way. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Last Saturday night, I was driving back home from a camping trip. Instead of taking the main road, I decided to take a shortcut through the mountains. It was supposed to shave 2 hours off of my trip. The rural route might have been fine during the day, but I didn't know the way, and the lack of streetlights through the wilderness made for a white-knuckle experience. One thing that never fails is that in godforsaken, remote places like that, there's little cell service and even less GPS reliability. As my car wound around sharp curves and the narrow, 2-lane blacktop, I cursed my decision to become Christopher Columbus. The GPS on my phone was rerouting continually, and I had to hope there were no more turns I needed to make until I got its bearings again. Roadkill was a frequent occurrence along the way, as I drove for miles without even passing another car or residence. It was just dense trees on either side of a lonely highway. I began to wonder if the road would ever straighten out, if there was any good to come from the nerve-wracking experience. At least it wasn't possible to fall asleep with so many corkscrew twists and turns. The GPS on my phone was so lost that I eventually fumbled around in the dark to shut the damn thing off. I guess I should have pulled onto the shoulder, but I thought I could multitask. Just as I had nearly found the off button on the side, I looked up to see something large in the middle of my lane. As a reflex, I darted to the opposite side of the road, but it had the same idea. The thud was both sobering and ugly. I screeched my brakes at least 3 seconds too late to avoid the collision. It was just a delayed reaction to an unlikely event. Besides the pulse-pounding rush of hitting a massive white animal in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, there was also the matter of its shocking appearance. Its gnarled horns shattered my windshield on impact, and blood and fur were streaked on the side of the car. The creature itself was gone by the time I'd pulled over to check on it. But that wasn't the unbelievable part. I swear to you, it was crossing the road on its hind legs. I couldn't begin to tell you what it was, but it was not a buck. I only had a 2 or 3 second glance at the creepy thing, but I know a deer when I see one, and this was not a deer. If I live to be 100, I'll never forget it. The solid white thing I hit was some sort of upright goat-looking beast. It had the reverse knees and hooves of a regular goat, and a long, narrow head with wide-set eyes. It also had upturned ears and a traditional goatee dangling from its chin like a regular billy goat, but it also had a humanoid-like torso. It evoked images of Alifa Levi's satanic Baphomet illustration. The mere thought of such a sinister thing like that being so nearby was terrifying. The most distinctive feature of the grotesque creature, however, were its ghastly eyes. I initially assumed they glowed from the radiance of my blaring headlights, but now I'm not so sure they weren't fiery red all the time. For the split second our eyes made contact, they pierced right through me. There wasn't as much fear in them, over the imminent collision of my advancing Tesla, as there was a furious display of malice directed squarely at me. It bared its fangs until the impact. The whole thing shook me up so much that I crept down the rest of the mountain road at quarter speed. I wasn't taking any more chances with phantom wildlife. Frankly, I felt lucky to be alive, and was anxious to put some much-needed distance between myself and that thing. Pulling into my driveway was a huge relief, but honestly, I only slept fitfully. Over and over I replayed the chilling incident in my head. What was that hideous thing in the woods? I tried to convince myself I had hallucinated the whole thing, but the considerable damage to my car was undeniable. The dents and shattered windshield wouldn't allow me to dismiss my unwanted encounter. The next day I called my insurance company to report the white deer accident, so I could get it repaired. Naturally, there was a complication. Without an accident report by the state police, they would only consider paying my claim with an official inspection by an adjuster. I guess they had too many bogus claims to just take my word for it. Also, they probably wanted to verify it wasn't an alcohol-related hit and run of a human being. Of that much, I was certain. I'd had a few beers on the camping trip, but I knew my sobriety wasn't an issue. Regardless, the officer who accompanied the insurance adjuster requested permission to draw a blood sample. All of a sudden, it went from a simple insurance claim to an official investigation. I permitted the blood test to clear me and alleviate any lingering suspicions, but the whole thing made me pretty nervous. Obviously, I didn't tell them certain details about the horned thing. I saw the previous night walking on its hind legs. Either that, or that it had haunting, blood-red eyes. Even suggesting I'd hit an albino deer caused a serious level of doubt. The other unbelievable details would surely result in a loss of creditability on my part, and legal action, and/or incarceration. I doubled down on the albino deer lie. There were traces of blood, skin, and clumps of white fur embedded in the twisted dents and damaged undercarriage. Initially, that helped my case, along with the fact that my car was whisper quiet and wouldn't give an animal as much advance warning. They even found a small piece of the animal's horn in my back floorboard. I guess the impact threw it through the shattered glass. The two men collected samples and put them in specimen bags for analysis. I hoped that would be enough to satisfy their investigation, but it looked like they weren't quite through. I knew that DNA sequencing would disprove it was a deer. The question was, what would it reveal? Several days went by. I avoided calling because I didn't want to appear too anxious, but eventually, I wanted my car repaired, and the matter resolved. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I broke down and called the claims number. The automated system said my claim was pending. That wasn't much help. I elected to give them a few more days. Finally, the adjuster called me. I could tell he had spent a great deal of time trying to phrase things in the most advantageous way. "We've ran those samples through the state analysis lab. There were some pretty big irregularities. They've informed us that the animal you hit was not a deer. They think it was some sort of wild, mutant goat." I had several days to anticipate that response, and immediately went into my plain reply. Huh, really? Well, as I said, it was very dark, and the darn thing darted in front of me before I could even hit the brakes. Whether it was a deer or any other wild animal, it should still be covered by my policy, right? I'd hate to think there was some sort of mutant goat exclusion clause. "Oh, we're going to fix your car, don't worry about that. I've already authorized the repair, but the state police have more questions for you. The lab tech who researched the samples for us told me the wild goat thing has highly unusual DNA and serious mutations. The authorities want to locate it for scientific study. You mentioned that despite the serious impact with your vehicle, it ran off afterward. Is that correct? Is there anything else you can offer?" I just sat there, unsure of what to say. Could I level with the guy? Would he believe me if I did? It seemed unlikely since I probably wouldn't believe it myself. Finally, he spoke up. "Are you still on the line?" After a long period of uncomfortable silence, I assured him I was there. I had just successfully convinced him to fix the damage to my car. There was nothing to gain by confessing no. I was torn between playing it safe and unburdening myself. I was so freaked out by witnessing that creepy ghoul that I really needed to tell someone else. As it turned out, the police wanted me to accompany them back to the accident scene. It was one thing to spill my guts about some supernatural goat man lurking in the woods. It was quite another to go back to that desolate place myself and tempt fate a second time. Worse still, the insurance guy let it slip that there had been a number of mysterious disappearances in that general area. The state police were hoping to find out if there was a potential connection. Considering how remote that godforsaken wilderness area was, it was hard to imagine it not being involved. I told him I'd think about it, but there was obviously a misunderstanding. The state investigator showed up at my front door the next morning, expecting me to go with him. He didn't look like the type to take no for an answer, so I grabbed my things and got in his government-issued, undercover car. The area looked a lot less menacing in the daytime, but I still didn't want to be there. Pinpointing the exact spot was hard. There were no mile markers or recognizable landmarks to distinguish one section from the other. Several times I thought we were at the right spot, but upon closer inspection, I had to admit that we were not. The officer I was with couldn't exactly be described as patient. Every time I misspoke, Dave became a little more gruff. Apologizing for being wrong just seemed to make him that much more tense and agitated. He definitely needed to learn how to relax. Finally, a curved section of the road looked very familiar. There were skid marks and some recent accident debris. I was pretty sure it was where I'd hit that grotesque beast. but with so many false stops, I was hesitant to commit on this one. "Is this it or not?" he grumbled. "I think so." "Look there in the ditch. I believe that's my mirror." Yeah. What are the chances of there being another Tesla mirror in the ditch around here? This is definitely the place I hit the, wild animal. We pulled off the road and into a nearby flattened thicket. Honestly, we could have parked in the middle of the highway with so little traffic passing by. In the entire time we entered the wilderness area, only one other vehicle passed us by. I was hesitant to get out of the car, but couldn't exactly explain my reasons to officer motivated. Tracking a wild albino goat seemed safe enough. Tracking a standing goat's-headed demon who was angry at me for hitting it with my car, not so much. "There's something I need to tell you," I offered. He looked at me with steely, blue eyes. "This thing is big. It doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before. I don't think it was natural. It was walking upright when I hit it." I half expected the guy to react angrily, or to burst out laughing at my unbelievable revelation. Oddly, he did neither. He stopped his cautious progress through the dense brush and turned to make full eye contact with me. "I know. I've seen it before. When I was on patrol duty a few years ago, I saw it at the edge of the tree line. It tried to hide, but my searchlight on the patrol car caught it in the beam for at least 10 seconds. I've been stalking that godforsaken thing ever since. There have been a half-dozen people who've disappeared in this section of the woods. They have never been found. I don't know what that monster is, or what it did to those poor people, but I'm betting it's still allergic to hot lead. It bled plenty from the impact of your fancy electric car. I'm going to take it down." I was stunned. Not only did he believe me, he had seen it too. As a matter of fact, he was on some sort of obsessed mission to kill it. I might have been more impressed if I wasn't marching into the woods with him, unarmed. He sensed my hesitation and tossed me a pistol. I can't say it made me feel any better. Trust me, that thing will haunt your dreams and your waking hours until we end it. If you'd admitted the truth to anyone, they would have teased you about it mercilessly. I know. I'm still the butt of chupacabra jokes to this day in my department. Finally, I had to stop talking about it to anyone else. They were never going to believe me, unless they'd seen it themselves. I reached out to various insurance companies to be informed of any accidents in the forest area. As soon as I saw your report, I knew you'd seen it too. You were smart to lie about it being an albino deer. 1,000 thoughts whirled around in my head. This guy had been planning his mission for years. He couldn't confide in anyone else or trust them to help. I was it. I barely knew which end of a gun to point and which end to hold. Officer Dave apparently didn't care. He just wanted someone to join in on the hunt that believed him. Obviously, I did, but I'd entered his little crusade after involuntary circumstances. One thing was for sure, there was no backing out now. "Do you know how to handle a firearm?" he quizzed. There was a marked hint of skepticism in his tone. I guess he'd already summed me up, but was hoping for a yes. My expression surely answered his question. He barked like a commando. "There is no safety. It is loaded. Keep your damn finger off the booger switch until it's time to fire." Realizing something was lost in translation, he rephrased. "I repeat, keep your finger off the trigger. Is that clear?" I nodded while removing my finger from the cold reassurance of the so-called booger switch. We walked through dense foliage and trees for hours. I could hardly believe I was on some suicidal mission to locate and shoot Chupacabra with tightly wound Officer Dave. He was fully committed, I less so, but there was a false sense of security in backing up a man who did what needed to be done. I had great trust in him and hoped that I could offer him some positive level of support. Unfortunately, I wasn't dressed for stalking a 7-foot mythical creature with glowing red eyes and 2-inch long fangs. There were gnats and ticks. There were snakes hidden in the dense leaf bed, but all that was the least of my worries. I was tired, thirsty, and the sun was getting low in the horizon. Whatever level of courage or brave put on, I was faking, would surely erode with the sunset. Dave and I quickened our pace. We were trying to find its lair while it slept. We stood to lose this strategic advantage of surprise once it awoke. I didn't want to, but it had to be said. "Dave, we need to turn back. This is its home turf. We are ill prepared to fight this thing in the dark. Why don't we come back with some more reinforcements? Maybe a few people and a tracking dog. I sensed the onset of fierce resistance from his body language, but he knew I was right. We needed to get back to the car. I don't mind telling you, once the sun starts going down, it sets quickly and then darkness descends. The return trail back was marked with clear evidence of our ragtag expedition into the woods. The leaves were disturbed, and the tree limbs were bent or broken off haphazardly. Night fell upon us before we reached the car. I was pretty nervous, but at least I wasn't alone. Dave's posture was that of disappointment and defeat. As a man who comes prepared for nearly anything, he had 2 flashlights and some survival gear. I let him lead the way. It was harder to retrace our path in the dark. Meanwhile, I kept a close watch on our flanks. Every shuffle of our feet rustled leaves and snapped twigs. We weren't escaping the detection of anything. At last, the clearing came into view. I could see long streaks of moonlight shining upon the open roadway. I couldn't articulate how relieved I was to escape the unforgiving deep forest canopy. That is, until I saw Officer Dave's mangled Crown Vic. It had been destroyed. The windows were shattered. The sides of the vehicle were dented and scraped up. Indefinitely worse, one of the tires was punctured with a large hole. If there was any doubt whatsoever about the identity of the culprit, there were hoof prints surrounding the car on all sides. The whole time we were searching for this evil thing, it was watching us. "Come on, let's get that tire changed and get the hell out of here," I hissed. "We've got to hurry before it comes back." I looked over at Dave. It was as if he hadn't even heard me. He was lost in deep thought. I assumed it was just extreme reluctance to leave the job undone, but I was wrong about that. He had apparently heard something which drew his attention. I started to repeat myself again, but he silenced me with his finger up to his lips. Before I knew it, he drew his service weapon and pointed it at the trunk. The light bulb went off. I finally understood. Officer Dave believed we were about to be ambushed. As we went to retrieve the spare tire, I raised my gun and pointed it to the other side in support. It was brilliant. How did this thing know what we would do? It clearly understood human behavior. Dave silently mouthed the words, "gas tank," as he motioned for both of us to back away to a safe distance. If there was any doubt about his suspicion, it was extinguished quickly. The trunk began to shake violently from the inside. It must have realized what we were about to do. Dave fired at the trunk in rapid succession. His first 4 rounds pierced the huge compartment. I followed suit with the gun he gave me. My first 2 missed the car entirely, but my 3rd shot hit the side in an area very near the bullseye. I think one of us definitely struck the beast, because it began to bray and squeal. Dave fired 2 more rounds. It was clearly a seasoned marksman with close groupings. My shots were all over the place, but there was something to be said about spreading the rounds around, especially when you're attempting to take out a chupacabra hiding in the trunk of a Crown Victoria. Officer Dave might have won the blue ribbon shooting match for his overall accuracy, but I definitely took home the unofficial grand prize. One of my errant bullets struck the fuel tank and roasted the entire car in a Hollywood blockbuster-style explosion. Despite firing a bevy of live rounds into the back end of an automobile, neither of us expected a blast of that intensity. The saboteur certainly wasn't going to be getting out of the trunk after that. I think Dave was a little annoyed though. He had some serious explaining to do for losing his government-issued vehicle, and, also, the proof he'd sought for so long was basically charred into barbecue. We had a long walk back to civilization. It was at least 7 miles before we could get a phone signal. Dave seems like a good guy. We talked a bit. He and I are going fishing next Saturday, but we won't be taking any rural shortcuts coming back home. The alarm clock sounded loudly through Jim's tiny apartment. He slammed his hand down on the clock to silence it. He groggily turned the clock into his sight of vision. The time read 4 o'clock. He sighed heavily. He sat up and moved to the edge of the bed, and stared down at the floor. His head was pounding from the night of booze and hot sex. He smiled at the lipstick-covered napkin, with the phone number on it that sat next to the clock. He had to be at work by 9, so he cleaned up and showered. He dressed and had a cup of coffee while he listened to the news. The news anchor spoke about comet dust that had entered the atmosphere. Jim paid little to no attention to the news, as it was just background noise. He gathered his things and headed out to his car. It was a chilly autumn day in the town of Willow Fog, and it seemed like rain was around the corner. He could smell it. But it didn't concern him because his job was indoors. Actually, it was in the basement with no windows. He arrived at work and the rain started coming down heavy. He ran to the front door, where Martin, the age-old security officer, buzzed him in. They exchanged a greeting when the second shift nurse strolled past Jim. She wore a smile on her face and a hickey on her neck. Jim had slept with her after his shift the previous night. He smiles back and punches the elevator button to go down. He enters and heads down and into his office. The morgue in the small town was often slow. Sometimes an accident from the main highway would bring some work. But most of the time, Jim spent his evenings filling paper and hanging out with Martin upstairs. Tonight would be no different. He headed back upstairs and surprised Martin with popcorn. "God damn it, son. Don't sneak up on me like that." Martin was 4 months away from retiring. He spent his evenings watching old monster movies at work. "Sorry, buddy. What are we watching tonight?" Martin glanced back and took a deep breath. The thing from another world. Jim pulled up a chair and sat next to the old man. Jim turned his attention to the door. He could see the rain had stopped. "Hell of a night, huh, Martin?" Martin didn't break his focus from the TV. "It's a hell of a night any time it rains, son." Jim had no reply, although he did agree. The movie was halfway finished when the emergency phone rang. Martin picks it up. "Willow Fog Morgue." He answered the same way he had since he started. "Alright, I'll let him know." Martin glances at Jim. "Local medics are bringing a body here. There was an accident on the highway." Jim sighed. He would have to prep an area for the body. Down in Coroner's room, he prepped a fridge and table for the body. The medics enter, pushing a stretcher with a body bag on it. "Here's your first victim for the night." The first medic proclaimed with little to no emotion. "What happened?" Jim asked, puzzled about the accident. The first medic's eyes didn't leave the paperwork, even though he answered. Apparently this person's body was in the middle of the road. It caused a huge 6-car wreck. There may be some more bodies about to join this one. Jim was somewhat shocked that this much action was taking place. Jim handed the paperwork back to the first medic when he noticed the second one staring at the body bag. He looked unnerved almost, as if he had seen a ghost. The other medic walked out the door, but the other stared at the body in a trance-like state. "Something wrong?" Jim asked, snapping him out of his hypnotic trance. The medic glanced up at Jim with a nervous look. "I don't know, honestly, but something isn't right about that body." Jim hadn't even unzipped the bag yet, but he could feel something was wrong. "What do you mean exactly?" Jim asked curiously. The medic glanced back at the body bag. "The body, it's like a fake body." Jim scratched his head, puzzled by the statement. "Fake? Fake like a mannequin fake?" The medic was about to speak when his partner came back through the doors. "Hey man, we got a lot going on, let's roll." His voice was loud and booming, and caused both men to jump. Jim wasted no time prepping himself to inspect the body. He got his gloves, body tags, glasses, and mask on. He unzipped the bag to reveal a headless, suited man. This wasn't the first decapitated body, and wouldn't be his last. But for a freshly decapitated body, there was no damage to his neck. He checked the pockets, but there was no ID, not even a wallet. He cut the suit off, and couldn't even find a tag for a store. The body itself was clean, no bruising or injury of any kind. Jim cut into the body. The blood was dry and congealed, the bones soft and mushy. The strangest thing of all, though, was there were not organs. Jim finished his inspection and placed the body inside a fridge. It had been an hour or so since the paramedics had left. He was expecting them back soon, so he decided to head back upstairs. He locked the doors and placed his keys in his pocket. He decided to walk the stairs as his legs needed a stretch. When he got back to the front desk, Martin was watching the end of the first movie. He had eaten all of the popcorn, and Jim couldn't help but be a little upset. "Couldn't save any for me, Martin?" Martin laughed out loud. "Sorry, kid. I wasn't thinking about it." Jim sighed and then noticed something out the front door. "Hey, Martin, isn't that the ambulance from earlier?" Martin glared out the door. "Yeah, it is, kid." Jim walked closer to the front door, and when he noticed the ambulance was coming in hot. "Martin, is it just me or does it seem like the ambulance is going pretty fast?" Martin paused the movie and moved to the door. The parking lot was large for a small building. The red lights were getting closer. "Why the hell do they still have their lights on?" Martin asked inquisitively. Jim didn't have an answer, but it was odd. Then with no warning, the ambulance overturned on its side and slid to a stop. Martin, get someone on the phone now. Martin shuffled to the phone when Jim opened the door. What the fuck is going on? He thought to himself. But before he could even make it to the sidewalk, he could see the driver's side door fly open. The medic from earlier climbed out of the side. He shut the door and started running towards Jim. Jim wasn't sure what to do. The medic looked hurt, but it wasn't stopping him from running full speed towards the lobby. Get the fuck inside now, the medic screamed out. Jim stood stunned when Martin came from behind him. What's he saying, kid? Jim couldn't answer, but the warning rang out from the medic again. Get inside. Jim and Martin both walked back in when the medic came in behind them. Lock the door. Lock it now. He shouted in a voice that was gasping for air. Jim locked the door and turned to Martin. Jim and Martin looked at the medic. His arm and face had cuts in them, possibly from the wreck. Jim snapped out of his frozen state and talked to the medic. What in God's name is happening? The medic looked up at Jim and Martin both, sweat pouring from his brow. I don't know. We got back on the crash, and it looked like a war zone. The accident victims, the dead ones, they were alive and attacking the police and other ambulance drivers. Jim looked over at Martin. He could feel his body start to shake. Did you get anyone on the phone? Martin, still stunned himself, simply shook his head no. Jim looked back at the panting medic. Okay, you have to slow down and tell me what's going on. The medic finally caught his breath. He stood up and glanced out the door. We got the call for the accident. When we got there, the body was brought earlier was in the middle of the road. Other ambulance drivers and police with firefighters arrived. When we got back, the police car was turned over and in flames. The firefighters and cops were fighting the victims. Martin pulled a first aid kit from out under the desk. He opened and gave the medic some gauze pads and alcohol wipes. The medic caught his breath and continued. We got out, and one of the accident victims jumped on my partner and bit him. I was able to get him back inside the bus, but he started convulsing. Jim grabbed his cell phone from his pocket. There was no reception. He stared back at the medic again. What happened next? The medic wrapped a pad around his arm. He walked back to the door. He has this horrible black goo start oozing from his eyes, ears, and mouth. I tried to dial it in, but I got nothing. Then he started attacking me. I headed here because it was the closest place I could think of. He grabbed the wheel and caused the crash. Martin sat back in his chair when he fearfully shouted for them both to come back to the desk. The medic and Jim both watched as Martin turned the news reports up on the TV. The reporter behind the desk seemed frantic and his face discolored. Martin turned the volume up louder to hear what was being said. We have reports of mass outbreaks of violence throughout the country. We are not sure why this is happening, but stay indoors. We will report back as soon as we have more news. We repeat, stay indoors and don't go outside for any reason. All three men looked coldly at the screen. Phones were down, cells, and landlines. The internet wouldn't even load on the main computer. They were cut off from the world, with no idea what was lying in wait. What do you think this is? Some kind of zombie outbreak? Martin asked the other men who stood beside him. Then, without warning, the door from the ambulance flew open. The other medic climbed out. He jumped down onto the sidewalk and started vomiting a black substance from his mouth. His right leg that appeared to be snapped in half dragged behind him. His body fell over and began to shake violently. His clothes and skin began to tear. Oh, fuck, Jim said aloud. What is happening? The body split open. Vines with thorns tore from his chest cavity. They pushed the body into a standing position. His head started to twist and spin, and like a melon, exploding on cement cracked open. Plant-like stalks exploded from his neck. Then a bouquet of flowers emerged from the bloody mess. All three men in unison screamed aloud. The plant monster began spitting the black ooze all over the parking lot, then slowly walked to the front door. Martin, shut the metal gate. Do it now. Jim yelled for Martin, who quickly did as he was told. The monster made his way to the door and extended its vines up the metal lattice. The medic and Jim both stared heavily at the monster that blocked the front door. Guys, you better come look at this, Martin proclaimed in a shaky voice. They gathered around the security desk when Martin pulled up the cameras from inside. Terror filled their faces as they watched the headless body from downstairs bust out of the cooler. More vines moved the body to the floor. The same action they watched happen outside was now happening with the headless man. The cadaver exploded open, this time from the middle. Black ooze gushed out as more vines exploded from the inside. This time a bulb emerged from the chest. The bulb opened and 4 giant red flaps emerged. It looks like a giant flower. The medic chalked the words out. The vines wrapped around the fridge doors and yanked them open. The middle of the flower pushed rows of jagged teeth into the clear. The vines dragged a body across the floor and then lifted it up. It dropped the corpse onto the center of the petals. The teeth began rotating. The vines dropped the body inside. The rotating teeth chewed up the deceased like a wood chipper. It repeated the process several more times until it had its fill. It pushed itself up on a counter, opened up again, and a yellow pollen exploded from its mouth. The pollen coated the room. More plants began to hatch from the remaining corpses. Oh my god, we're screwed, Jim said loudly, and slammed his hands on the counter. The monster outside had now overtaken the metal lattice. The monster in the morgue would soon have 4, maybe even 5 more like it in no time. The men felt hopeless, but Martin had an idea. Fellas, I think I have an idea. The medic and Jim looked at Martin as he explained. Martin stood up and turned the camera on for the back lot. My van is in the back. If we leave now, we can try and go somewhere else. The idea didn't seem bad, but this was happening everywhere. Listen, Martin, we should get out of here, but I think we should try and kill these assholes first. The medic nodded. I agree, but how? Jim shut his eyes for a moment and tried to think, but nothing came to mind. There were no guns of any kind, and his saws were all downstairs. Electricity, Martin shouted aloud. We could set up the defibrillators to the doors and fry those suckers. Jim smiled. I think that might work. A cracking noise came from the basement. Martin turned the camera back to the morgue. Oh no, this isn't good. They all stared as the bodies began to reanimate. Each one that had been touched by the pollen were now moving. They all morphed in the same way, and now were pounding on the door. We have to act now, the medic said to the others. We need a plan, and we need it now. The glass from the front door started cracking as the first monster was growing in size. Alright, Martin and medic, follow me. The primary nurse room had 2 defibrillators, both which were at full power. The glass in the front door exploded, and the vines slowly crawled down the hall. The medic rolled the machine into the hall. He powered it up as Jim put the paddles to the mutated vines. The vines shot back to the door. The men gave chase. Jim pushed the paddles to the metal frame of the door. The bolt blew the monster off the door. The vines lay motionless on the outside. Martin grabbed a bottle of alcohol from the first aid kit. He squirted the once human body down. He pulled a lighter from his pocket, lit some paper, and threw it to the monster. The monster screamed in pain as it burned to nothing. They all went back inside when the flour-covered cadavers busted from the morgue door. The medic dumped the water cooler on the floor. It puddled at the plant monster's feet. Jim pushed the paddles down and shocked the floor. All the monsters shrieked in pain. Martin began smothering the bodies with the remaining alcohol. He lit them all on fire. Soon the whole building was starting to burn. They ran to Martin's van and drove off. The building exploded behind them. Martin turned the radio on when a report came over the air. We have reports now that the dust from the comet early this morning had formed in our atmosphere. It is of unknown origin, but when it formed into rain, it caused plants to become carnivorous and parasitic. This is a worldwide outbreak. If you come in contact with someone who is infected, you must burn the body. They drive through town, only to see people running and screaming in fear. They wondered, how long would this last? Where could they go? Who could they trust? But more importantly, would life continue? Nowhere was safe. No one was safe. After driving for a few hours, they made it to the outskirts of town. They stopped and got out. They could see their small town. It was burning, and gunshots could be heard ringing out. A military convoy carrying people out of town passed them. In the very back, Jim saw something familiar. It was a man. The man was wearing a suit. The same suit he had taken off the headless corpse earlier. The corpse had survived the fire, and to make it worse, it had a brand new head. I was headed toward the tall, swanky building in Chicago for an interview. I already had gotten 15 odd interviews while still getting nowhere, and my frustration levels were at an all-time high. This in-person interview, however, alleviated some of my depression, as the invitation to come to the firm's office to get to know them was a nice gesture. And I was actually in good spirits as I approached the all-glass building. My entry through the revolving door led me into a large, well-lit lobby. Something out of a Harry Potter movie. I got my temp entry badge from a grinning guy manning a large desk, and headed to the hall that housed 8 elevators, 4 on each side. My destination was on the 58th floor. Everything was larger than life, you see. I was elated as I entered the elevator when the door slid open. It was huge and empty, as I was coming in at 2 p.m. Not exactly rush hour. The elevator doors slowly clunked closed, and I was immersed in silence. For some unexplainable reason, my elation from a few seconds ago vanished in an instant, and a creepy feeling that something's not right gripped my insides. I brushed it off as my nervousness for the meeting, and looked at the buttons. It was actually a sleek touch display, and one had to scroll up and down the floor numbers to select the right one. Each floor number had names of the companies that were housed there. Neat. As I began scrolling up from my floor, I noticed something peculiar. There was no option for floor 42 and 53, and as I scrolled up farther and farther, some floor company names changed into a script that I didn't recognize, and switched right back, like a glitch. It's a glitch, you idiot. I thought to myself, it's not a script. Why did you even think of that? I chided myself for being silly at such an important meeting. I selected 58 and pressed the arrow on the screen. The elevator dinged once faintly and rumbled into motion. Going up, said a soothing woman's voice from a speaker somewhere as the elevator gained velocity. The floor numbers on the display changed rapidly. L, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 16, 24, 36. Rumble and screech. 48. More screeching. 58. Even in my state of sweaty nervousness from the weird elevator ride and the anticipation of the interview, I hadn't failed to notice that the rumbling had happened as the elevator passed the missing floors. It's just construction work, I reminded myself as the doors dinged open loudly, and the voice spoke again. 58. My ears were blocked and thudding with my heartbeat due to the rapid ascent. As I stepped out into the marble lobby, I approached the glass door with the logo of the company etched on it, tagged my badge on the scanner, and entered when the scanner turned green and the door clunked unlocked. I was greeted with a large open office space with a ton of natural light pouring in from windows that connected ceiling to the floor. I walked up to the girl at the desk. She didn't look up, immersed in her computer screen with a bored look on her face. I cleared my throat expecting her to notice. She didn't. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said. She finally looked up, bored expression not changing a bit. "Yeah? I'm here for an interview at 2:30 with Mr. Mann." "Whatever." "Excuse me?" I did a double take. "Water?" Her expression suddenly changed into a large grin as she stood up excitedly as she walked around the desk to me. No thank you," I said, taken even more aback at this shift. "Mr. Mann will be right with you." She kept on grinning ear to ear. A door opened behind me, and a tall man in business casuals walked over. He was grinning ear to ear too, for some reason. "I'm Joe Mann. Nice to meet you. Come on in." I was led inside for the interview. The interview was actually unremarkable when compared to the eerie things happening around it. It went well, actually. But for some reason, my mind had lost the elation, and something was bothering me as I walked out of the interview room. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what wasn't feeling right in the back of my head. As I was walking out of the main glass door with these thoughts in my head, the girl spoke up enthusiastically. "All the best, Flesh." "What the fuck?" I thought as I turned and faced her. "All the best, Mr. Fletcher." "For the interview result?" She grinned like she hadn't just spouted another weird sentence for the day. "I'm not Fletcher, but thank you." I hurried out. I didn't want to stay in this building any longer. After that interaction, my instinct had begun tugging at me to get the hell out. You know that feeling, when everything at face value is perfectly normal, but something sinister is happening beneath. It was with that feeling that I entered the elevator, which was already waiting for me. The door already open, no less. She was waiting with her mouth open for me. "No, you idiot. Elevators don't have a mouth." I rebuked myself again. Why did I even bring that weird thought up? Someone must have gotten out and hence the elevator door was open, I rationalized with myself. I felt blank as I looked at the digital screen. I was sweating again. The elevator doors rumbled as they closed, enveloping me in silence like I was submerged in dry water. Was I drowning? No, I'm just in an elevator. That's it. I reminded myself and literally shook my head to clear my thoughts. I looked at the screen again and scrolled down to L, ignoring the missing floors. No glitches this time. I pressed the arrow and the elevator dinged, as the woman chimed soothingly, going down. As I was getting accustomed to the brief feeling of low gravity due to the downward motion of lift, there was an abrupt metallic screech, and the elevator came to a halt with a thud. I jumped out of my sweaty stupor, my senses alert. I looked at the display, and even before I registered what I was seeing, my subconscious already knew what number would be on screen. 53. Calm down, I told myself. It's only a construction malfunction or something. The door will open to a dusty floor with a bunch of hard-hat construction workers apologizing, and will assist you in going down. No biggie, I assured myself. But the door didn't open. I pressed the arrow button on the screen. Nothing. I tried scrolling up and down, but the numbers didn't move. I started sweating profusely now. Was I going to be one of those stories I heard where someone got trapped in an elevator and were rescued 15 hours later? I pressed the speaker icon on screen to try and activate the helpline or something. Nothing. Just silence ringing in my ears. That won't help, dear. A woman's voice rippled with maniacal giggles pierced through the silence. The elevator woman's voice, no longer soothing. What the hell? My heart began racing now. My instincts could feel an immediate but unseen danger. Weren't these elevator sounds recordings? Who just left and talked to me? Was the elevator alive? What is even happening? If Uncanny Valley was a feeling or a situation, I would have said this was it. I looked around for the source of the sound or a camera. There was none. I tried pressing the microphone icon on the screen again. Nothing. I braced myself to hear the horrific laughter, but it was just silence. Now I pressed a bunch of icons on the screen out of frustration. Then I heard it. A static crackle like that of a radio. It was coming from a small speaker grill above the display. This was my chance. Hello? Is anyone there? I'm stuck in this elevator. Hello? I shouted hopefully into the grill. The crackling continued for a few seconds, then I heard a voice. A man's deep voice. Make sure to wrap them correctly, or they spill blood all over the fucking floor. Okay, I was officially terrified of the unknown now. Anything could happen. I braced myself for the absurd, the paranormal. I listened farther. I'll drain them completely next time. We should start collecting the blood as well. Could be useful. Save a bottle for my family. Both of the men started laughing through the radio crackle. My horrific trance was punctured by a loud ding as the elevator doors parted. I watched, unblinking, as the view unfolded in front of me. The floor was a construction site as I guessed, but something was wrong as I immediately noticed. There were drag marks leading from the elevator to the far end of the floor. The floor was covered in splotches of dry red color. Something brown was piled up on all the corners. I couldn't make it out, but I was sure I saw a skeletal arm jutting from one pile. I heard footsteps approaching from somewhere. My heart rate was jacked to max. My flight mode was activated, as I literally slammed on the display multiple times, bile rising up my throat, burning my insides. The footsteps were now seconds away. The elevator doors began to close. I was backed up against the elevator wall as the doors met in the middle. Going down, the voice chimed again, almost mockingly now. My heart was ready to rip through my ribcage as I anticipated the worst. The elevator rumbled down steadily until the display read L. I stared at it for a second, heart calming down. The display seemed to mock me as well. The doors opened to the well-lit, familiar, and safe lobby. I didn't hear any more sound from the elevator, like the elevator was just daring me to question the absurdity of what I experienced. As I stepped out, the halls were empty. Even the service desk wasn't manned, except for a janitor happily mopping up light red drag marks. As I walked out cautiously and stared at the scene, the man grinned at me, ear to ear. Just some cranberry juice. How was the interview, sir? I hadn't asked him what the liquid was. I hadn't told him I had been here for an interview. I didn't even know this person. I ran out of the building without answering or looking back. 3 days later, I received a job offer from that firm with a $3,000 sign-on bonus. I'm not responding to that offer. Ever. It had been close to the bent old elm tree, where I had noticed a tiny white hand poking up from the ground. A series of robberies that had occurred around our area had put us on edge. When I'd heard scuffling sounds from the surrounding woods around our house early that morning, my shotgun had been quickly loaded and placed in hand. The tips of the leaves had already begun to darken and shrivel on the bright green trees, with some even having drifted to the ground on the gentle morning breeze. Rocky had led the way, his tail wagging high in the air, and nose trailing along the ground, just as eager to protect our home as I was. He alerted me with a bark, having picked up on something's scent. My eyes had drifted along the ground, before catching sight of the unfamiliar object amongst the long, swaying grasses. I had squinted for a few minutes, before making out a human shape. My heart had all but exploded within my chest. The shotgun had dropped to the ground as I rushed forward to dig the small shape out of the twigs it had been buried in. I found myself clutching the rigid wrist of a small doll. Two glassy brown orbs stared out at me from a pale porcelain face, framed by long, curling eyelashes. Her long strawberry blonde hair had been done up into elaborate ringlets that trailed over the puffed sleeves of the pink Victorian-style dress she was wearing. Her rosy lips were curled into an enigmatic smile, as if she knew something no one else did. Despite a few specks of dirt on her skirt and some twigs clinging to her shiny hair, she was in near perfect condition. She could have been sitting on the shelf of some antique shop between a dusty, leather-bound book. I couldn't imagine who would dump it here. I had been a typical little girl. My childhood had been long consumed by a love for dolls. Barbies, Bratz, American Girl, and Polly Pockets had populated my room, covering the surface of every ledge and dresser. The best days of my life had always been when my grandmother would let me play with some of the older ones when I'd gone to her house. I would spend hours dazzled by their perfect, fragile faces and long trailing gowns. The ones that I'd found here would have fitted in perfectly within her collection. As my finger traced the smooth outline of her rosy cheek, warm memories flooded back to those sweet, simpler times where the biggest worry I'd had was accidentally breaking one of them. I felt the same childhood urge resurface to take the lonely little doll home to live with me. However, my girlfriend, Enid, was less than pleased by it. "Burn it," was the first thing she'd uttered when she saw it propped up on our mantelpiece. I'd only rolled my eyes at her words. "It's a doll, honey, not a monster." "It looks like it should be locked away inside a glass case," she scoffed. "The kind that says, 'Do not open under any circumstances.' This isn't a horror movie, this is real life. Well, that thing looks like it crawled right out of the former." She turned away from it with a barely suppressed shudder of disgust. "I'm getting the matches," she murmured. "You do that, and I'm getting a divorce." I shot back. She paused as she had been exiting the doorway, looking back over her shoulder at me with a deadpan expression. One eyebrow quirked upwards. "Please, you know you could never leave me. I'm the one thing kept you from killing yourself. If I wasn't here, you'd probably be inviting a hockey mask wearing stranger with a machete over for dinner right now." I shook my head with a laugh. As caustic as Enid could be, I could never stop loving her. Even for a second, she was my best friend. She was always the smart one. I know that now. Still, looking at the doll, I couldn't understand what had unnerved her so much. I only felt a surge of maternal protection toward the small, delicate features. Being a huge child at heart, or just an over-sentimental idiot, I decided to give her a name, after my favorite doll as a child, Samantha. I was probably the only one in the house who took to her. Rocky, who would normally lap up and lick the face of anyone with a pulse, would cower outside the door of the room where Samantha was, and no amount of coaxing would get him to enter. Even Kiwi, our parakeet, who would chirp the ear off anyone, stood silent in its cage whenever the doll was present, and Need still refused to go anywhere near her. I couldn't understand why either of them were so apprehensive. All those horror stories about dolls had seemed so laughable to me, when my own had given me nothing but joy. To me, there was nothing wrong with her. Samantha was a doll, and nothing more. It was almost a week after I had found Samantha under the tree, when Enid had shaken me out of my restful night's sleep. "I heard something downstairs," she hissed, her eyes flashing with panic. We sat there, listening out for anything, with only the hushed sound of our breathing breaking the quiet. When we heard it, a loud, distinct bump from downstairs, like something falling over. Thoughts of intruders in ski masks after our valuables resurfaced in my mind. I pushed open the bedroom door and I was already down the stairs, making a beeline for the gun cabinet when I heard the sound again, from the living room. I saw something small on the ground. After taking a few hesitant steps towards it, it suddenly became familiar. Long, reddish blonde curls falling over its face. Samantha. She must have fallen off the mantel in the night. I brushed a stray curl out of her flawless face, her eyes sparkling up at me. Kiwi quivered in the corner of his cage. Blue-gray feathers flared as he watched me put her back. He hopped back as far as he could on his swinging bird ledge and let out a low squawk. "It's okay, Kiwi. Samantha's only a doll. She won't hurt you." It felt like everyone around me was going insane. Samantha was an object. There was no way she could hurt anyone. So why were they all so afraid? One morning, I had woken up to the sight of Rocky's limp body strewn across the bedroom landing. When I had turned him over, I saw white frothing from his mouth. We'd broken more than a few speed limits on our way to get him to the vet, but by the time we'd arrived, it was already too late. The vet had sighed, his face solemn. We had taken Rocky for checkups since he was a puppy, so he understood our grief. He had been just as confused as we were. The only rational explanation that he could scrape together was a black widow bite. That night, Anita and I sat together and cried in a way that we hadn't done in a long time. We hadn't just lost our pet, we had lost a best friend. We buried him in the backyard, where we could always see him frolicking from the kitchen windows. It just didn't make sense. In all the time we had lived in this area, there had been no black widow spiders, but Rocky was dead. It didn't stop me from calling an exterminator the next day, after we'd buried him. Between Rocky and the scratching that I was starting to hear downstairs, I knew that I had a valid enough reason. After practically prying our house apart and searching every crack and crevice, the exterminator had shaken his head. "I can't find any harbingers," he admitted. "There doesn't seem to be any spiders. You're definitely sure that it was a black widow bite?" "There has to be," I protested. "Nothing," he admitted. "The whole place is practically airtight." Kiki wasn't doing any better than we were. He refused to eat. Instead, cowering in the corner of his cage, he didn't chirp or talk anymore, instead switching between silence and screaming. The sandpaper floor in his birdcage was littered with his own bloodied feathers that he'd pecked out, his body dotted with painful pink patches. He and Rocky had always been close, to the point of even sitting on his back. I thought it was his own way of grieving. With the pain of losing Rocky still raw in my heart, I had turned to Samantha for comfort. I had found my fingers threaded through her soft hair and stroking her cold, stiff skin. Whenever I looked at that tiny, upturned mouth, everything was alright again. I was probably the only one who could stand being around her. "Can you just put that thing in the attic? It creeps me the hell out." Anid snapped. I could already feel her disgusted sneer burning through my back towards Samantha. I placed down the rag I'd been using to polish her face and turned back to her. "Oh, yeah. She's just sitting there and looking adorable. That's really unsettling." Unlike the other times we'd had this conversation, the scowl that Anid was wearing didn't slide from her face. "I'm serious. I hate looking at it. I can feel its eyes follow me around the room. I don't know what dimension would consider that thing adorable. Give it a rest, will you? She's just a doll." I didn't mean to say it as harshly as I did, but the damage had already been done. Anid's upper lip curled into a grimace, and she exited the room with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Anid, wait." But she was already gone. Anid was hurting too. She needed time to heal from what had happened. I knew Samantha was driving a rift between us, and as much as I adored her, I wasn't about to put a doll over the woman I loved. I started to weigh up my options. eBay was a good place. Though she wasn't exactly pristine, I knew that I would get some good money for Samantha. That night was spent just as sleepless as the last, eyes darting around the room to Anid sleeping back, lying next to me. My skin stiffened from the cold atmosphere between us, wondering when it would thaw out. I had leaned back into my pillow, my eyes about to close, trying to finally rest when I heard the same clatter and scratches. It was white noise to me by this stage, and I had been about to drift off when a sound pealed up that seemed to echo into my very bones. A little girl giggling. I was out of that room like a bullet. Every creak of the staircase made me flinch, but I forced myself downstairs, determined to prove to myself that it was just my own sleep-deprived imagination. There was no way that I could have heard it. My phone in hand, I guided myself to the hallway light switch. My chest sagged as light burst in, revealing everything where it should have been. It seemed that Anita and I were the only two people in the house. With my own curiosity satisfied, I was about to head back upstairs to the comfort of a warm bed, when something small scuttled past my feet into the darkness of the living room, so fast that it was just an indistinct blur of limbs. I stood there, my ears picking up the slightest movement of whatever was moving in there. I swallowed. After palming around the walls for the distinct outline of the light switch, I resorted back to the light of my phone, as it fell on Kiki's cage. I noticed the doors were open, or rather, crumpled open, having been torn off by something. Kiki was nowhere in sight. Shining around, something silvery flashed into my view. It was suspended from every surface of the room, trailing from the top of a mantelpiece to the walls in long gossamer like threads. A wriggling movement distracted my attention away from it, and the torch of my phone revealed a trembling Kiki suspended in a cocoon. My knee joints locked in place, mouth falling open. Something dropped down from the ceiling, hanging from a thread like some demented marionette. Her tiny arms were open toward me, and head dropped, long reddish blonde hair falling as a veil over her face. I knew what, or rather who, it was, but still couldn't believe what I was seeing. Samantha's neck creaked up, brown eyes fixed on me. I could only watch as 8 long black legs unfurled themselves from the tear in the front of her dress. They extended at least 2 feet outward, longer than the rest of her body. Her flawless porcelain features cracked open into a jagged chalice array, vibrating with a low hiss and already dripping with venom. "Babe?" The intruding voice terrified me more than what it was in front of me. Whipping around, I saw Anita standing in front of me, rubbing the sleep out of her eyes as she squinted into the darkness. Her eyes expanded as she made out what was inside. The color draining from her face, her mouth fell open and she stood there, paralyzed by fear. What the hell? Before she could even finish, Samantha had plummeted to the ground, scuttling on her belly with lightning speed before lunging at her. Within seconds, she had Anita pinned to the floor, who was screaming and struggling to hold back her snapping jaws. A sudden fear-fueled adrenaline burst snapped me out of my shock. I raced to the gun cabinet, struggling to load the bullets in as her screams echoed from just a few rooms away. When I finally fitted them into the chamber, I rushed back to find Samantha inches away from sinking her razor teeth into Anita's skin. I aimed the barrel toward the tiny head with my trembling hands. As my finger enclosed around the trigger, a brief image of Rocky flashed through my mind. The force of the shot blew the creature almost 3 feet into the air, before landing in the entrance of the living room. Running to my girlfriend, I scooped up her trembling body into my arms. "It's okay. Breathe. It's gonna be okay." I held her at that moment, like I would never let go. She suddenly went stiff in my hands, and my heart dropped. Her head was tilted toward the living room doorway, a hand clasped to her whimpering mouth. Looking up, I caught the sight of the small shape slowly rising from the floor. Samantha stared at us with a single, cold dead eye. The right side of her mouth almost entirely blown off, leaving it a warped crescent. Before either of us knew it, she was already running at us. I shuttered my eyes, holding Anita close, preparing for the inevitable, that horrible laughing all around us. I opened them to find us both still alive, with the click of her contorted limbs disappearing into the next room. The confusion of it all gave way to pure fear when the truth dawned on me. The dog door. Pushing myself to my feet, I raced after the sound. I saw the miniature outline of her form next to the flap, held aloft by her arachnid limbs. Her head snapped around at me, still wearing that sweet smile, one that now made my stomach turn. Then, with one final titter, she pushed herself through before I could catch her. I found myself sprawled on the floor, clutching at nothing, the abrasive chill of the night's air slapping against my face with each swing of the aluminum flap. With Samantha having long disappeared into the shadowy coverage of the trees. After we'd peeled back the webbing, we found Kiki, somehow still alive. But he refused to leave the safety of his cage for any reason. He was so quiet that we would have to check on him from time to make sure he wasn't dead. Anita and I tried to continue our normal routine. Neither of us knew how to address what had happened in the first few days after the incident. My mind often wanders back to that night, where she slipped through my fingers. I still don't know what it was that I found in those woods and let loose on the world, but I don't think that I want to find out. The gun is never far from my reach now. It needs recovering too. We've been learning to talk about it, and her nightmares are becoming less frequent. Still, it doesn't stop her from flinching every time she sees a doll in a movie or a TV. She can't even say the word without a tremble slipping in. She has a reason to be afraid of them now. I do too.